Welcome to our class, Genesis, the Conflict Over Creation. We're glad that you joined us to study how to handle and carefully interpret the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. Our instructor is James Rochford. In this opening episode, we will study the genre of Genesis 1 through 3. Is Genesis history, poetry, or mythology?
Are the early chapters of Genesis a historical account? Now, we're not going to bore you with the different accepted definitions of what we mean by history. As important as these careful definitions are to scholarship, it is really beyond our aim here in this class. Suffice it to say, by history, we simply mean that the events recorded in the opening chapters of Genesis actually occurred in reality. To borrow a phrase from the late Francis Schaeffer, the events in Genesis occurred in real space and time. That is, the events of the early chapters of Genesis actually occurred, actually happened. Well, we'd like to contend that according to the genre of literature and the book itself, that Genesis purports to be history. Now, it's beyond our aim to give a robust case for why the events in Genesis are actually facts or factual. The aim of this study is merely to identify what the author intended when he wrote these accounts. So did he intend them to be accurate accounts of the past? We think so, for a number of reasons. For one, it would be odd to treat the Bible itself as historical, but Genesis as mythological. Think about this. If we take the rest of the Bible to recount real events, why would we understand its foundational chapters as mere myths? God is the central figure in Genesis chapter 1:1 to 2:3, being mentioned more times than there are verses. He's mentioned 36 times in those 34 verses. So if Genesis 1 is mythological, then we have to ask a very difficult question. Is God himself also a myth? Number two, the expression, this is the account, this is the Hebrew term toledot, which connects the Genesis narrative from beginning to end. This Hebrew term literally means generations, and it comes from the Hebrew root word yalad, that means beginnings or births. And the text of Genesis uses this term something like 11 times. Now, this structure indicates that the narratives should be understood as historical, really focusing on the origins of Israel back to the time of Adam and Eve, the first human couple and the parents of all humans. Therefore, it is doubtful to think that one section of Genesis is mythical, namely Genesis 1 through 11. While the rest of the book is historical, that is, Genesis 12 to the end of the book, chapter 50. This is simply an artificial division imposed on the text by modern interpreters. This is not one that is self-evident in the text of Genesis. To those who claim otherwise, they must shoulder the full burden of proof to convince us of some kind of a split between Genesis 1:11 and the rest of the book. Third, the grammar and the syntax of Genesis implies typical Hebrew prose narrative. Genesis uses what is called the Vav consecutive. This Hebrew letter, Vav, means and. It's a conjunction. And Genesis 1 uses the Vav consecutive 51 times. And God said, and God saw, and so forth. This grammatical structure is rare in Hebrew poetry, but it is completely common throughout Hebrew prose in the Old Testament. Fourth, Genesis 1 through 3 contains historical references. Even critical scholars of the Old Testament recognize historical markers in the early chapters of Genesis. For instance, referring to the 4 rivers that are mentioned in Genesis chapter 2, critical scholar Gerhard von Rad states this: this strangely profound section strives without doubt to sketch the real geographical world. Likewise, Assyriologist E.A. Spicer states that the physical setting cannot be dismissed offhand as sheer imagination. Now, these scholars here, they are not saying that Genesis is factual, but they are saying that it claims to be factual. It claims to be historical. Fifth, other Old Testament texts treat Genesis as historical. Many passages can make this point, but we'll just consider one of these. Psalm 136 recounts the great wonders of God in history in verse 4. These include creation, verses 5 through 9, the Exodus, verses 10 through 15, the wilderness wandering, verse 16, the conquest of Canaan, verses 17 to 24, and even the contemporary moment of the author at the end of the psalm. And if you notice, as you read through this psalm, the psalmist, this author, makes no distinction between these events, as though some were mythical and others were historical. He treats all of these as historical from beginning to end. Sixth, and finally, ancient interpreters understood Genesis to be historical. Josephus, the Roman Jewish historian of the first century, refers to the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, as quote-unquote history. Is Genesis poetry?
Genesis 1 is a poem. Genesis 1 has an enormous amount of repetition. Don't you see it? Over and over again. You have the evening and the morning was the first day, the evening and the morning was the second day, and God says, and it was so. And God said that it was good. Repetition, repetition, repetition. You get to Genesis 2, it's totally different. Why? Because Genesis 2 is historical reporting, and Genesis 1 is a song. And because Genesis 1 is a song, we ask the general questions, not the specific. We don't press
Francis Collins, who himself is a theistic evolutionist and the founder of the BioLogos organization, cavalierly calls the early chapters of Genesis, quote, poetry and allegory. Now, no one would dispute that the author of Genesis 1 carefully constructed this text, employing rigorous repetition and a stylized structure. For example, he uses the repetition, and there was evening and there was morning on the nth day, first, second, third day. Let there be over and over. God said, and it was so, and it was so. So this is a carefully crafted, stylized chapter. However, this does not mean that Genesis is poetry. For one, other sections of Scripture use repetition and structure. For example, the genealogies of Genesis employ laborious repetition. As anyone would know, Genesis chapter 5, and so begat so-and-so, and he lives such and such amount of years. And on it goes. Genesis 5, 10, and 11. And other passages in the Bible, like Numbers 7, use the same repetition. Yet, even critical scholar Gerhard von Rad holds that the genealogies were considered to be, quote, unmythologically within the realm of history. We discovered the same structure throughout the entire book of Genesis with the repeated use of the term toledot, as I said, 11 different times. Second, Genesis 1 through 3 lacks standard Hebrew poetic devices. You see, Hebrew poetry uses parallelism, whether synonymous, antithetical, or synthetic parallelism, as well as intensification and personification. Yet, on the whole, Genesis does not use these poetic devices. Now, it's true that certain individual verses, like Genesis 1:27, 2:23, and the curses in chapter 3, verses 14 through 19, are some poetic verses, and these are usually rendered this way in English translations. But as a whole, Genesis is written as a narrative of historical events. Elsewhere, we see similar poetic predictions in the book of Genesis, but these are not to be confused with thinking that the text as a whole is not historical. By contrast, if we want to see a poetic genre for creation, we have chapters in the Bible that show us this. We should read Psalm 104, or Job 38 through 41. These chapters serve as a stark contrast containing the same content, but having a distinct and totally different genre of poetry. Even critical scholar Gerhard von Rad denies that Genesis 1 is poetry, appealing to Psalm 104 as a contrast. Third, even if it could be shown that Genesis 1 is poetry, this would not show how Genesis 2 is poetic. Gordon Wenham, a leading commentator on the book of Genesis, writes that Genesis 2:4 and onwards is straightforward Hebrew narrative prose. Is Genesis mythology, legend, or saga, as some would put it?
A story of creation in a historical sense, or is it metaphorical? And if you understand it as metaphorical, you don't really have the tension with evolution that you think it is. In other words, it's not two things to be reconciled, but it's two things that are telling very different kinds of stories. The Adam and Eve story is not explaining things scientifically, it's not even explaining things historically. It is explaining something theologically for the ancient people.
Theistic evolutionist Dennis Alexander considers Genesis to be mythological because it depicts God walking in the garden in Genesis 3:8. However, argues Alexander, God is not a man with legs. Well, this criticism is as superficial as it is misguided. Alexander, of course, fails to note the obvious that this depiction in Genesis 3:8 is what is called a theophany, or an appearance of God, which recurs throughout the Bible, including Genesis 18, later in the book, when God appears directly to Abraham in human form. So if Genesis 3 is mythological because of theophanies, then so is Genesis 18, as well as a number of different chapters in the Old Testament. Now, interpreters take this mythological approach to Genesis largely based on the influence of other ancient Near Eastern mythological accounts, which we find to be anything but parallel. Others would argue that Genesis is to be taken as myth based on the supernatural events recorded in its opening chapters. Yet, as Victor Hamilton plainly states, it is irresponsible and incorrect to speak of these stories as myths on those bases. The worldview of Genesis 1, with its articulation of God, nature, and ethical choices, transcends the worldview of the mythopoeic mind. To say all this, of course, says nothing about the truthfulness or falsehood of these stories. It claims only that they are non-mythic. What is it that Old Testament and Hebrew specialists have to say about the book of Genesis? Interpreting Genesis as historical literature is not a unique or original understanding of the text. Leading specialists in the field of Old Testament studies affirm the historical nature of the early chapters of Genesis. For example, C. John Collins calls Genesis a historical account, by which he means, quote, that the author wanted his audience to believe that the events recorded really happened. He considers Genesis 1 to be, quote, exalted prose narrative, and Genesis 2 through 3 to be, quote, normal prose narrative. He writes, the genre identification for Genesis 1 through 11, prehistory and protohistory, does not mean that the author had no concern for the real events. Far from it. It implies that real events form the background of his story. James Hoffmeyer, who is an expert in the Old Testament and an Egyptologist, affirms that Genesis 1 through 11 is historical. While the text uses various literary genres, as he puts it, he writes that the general tenor of the book, and Genesis 1 in particular, is intended to be thought of as describing real events. Gordon J. Wenham, who is one of the leading commentators on the book of Genesis, refers to the genre of Genesis, particularly chapters 1 through 11, as proto-history. But what does he mean by this? Well, he explains this for us. Wenham writes, "It is proto in that it describes origins, what happened first. It is also proto. It is setting out models of God and his dealings with the human race. It is historical in that it is describing past realities and the lessons that should be drawn from them." Moreover, he writes this, "It is not ordinary history that relies on contemporary sources." Well, of course, it's not. Or at least on sources much closer to the events it describes than Genesis 1 through 11 does. His distinction seems to rest on avoiding a literalistic interpretation of Genesis 1 through 11. This is what he refers to as the author's intent versus how a modern reader would read the text. Regardless of this proto-history terminology, Wenham affirms this: calling Genesis 1 through 11 myth is at least unwise, at worst misleading, and, as I shall argue, inaccurate. Later, he states that the events of Genesis 1 through 11 were, quote, viewed as real events. Earlier, he notes, quote, "We all hold that these narratives reflect real events, even if we shouldn't expect the literature to reflect the style of a, quote, 21st century journalist or historian." Well, of course, this is ancient literature that we're reading, and yet he considers the events in these early chapters to be real. Regarding the concept of identifying Genesis as myth, Wenham strongly desists. In normal vernacular, the term myth usually implies that the belief or the account is false. However, Wenham writes that this is not how the first authors or hearers of these stories would have viewed them. They would doubtless have held them in similar respect to our era's respect for modern cosmologies or other scientific theories. For these reasons, it is prudent to avoid the term myth in describing the genre of Genesis 1 through 11. Derek Kidner, who is another Old Testament scholar, reflects on the New Testament use of Genesis, and he concludes this: "These guidelines exclude the idea of myth and assure us that we are reading of actual pivotal events." Vern Poythress writes that Genesis 1 is in the genre of prose narrative. He grants that sometimes a genre may be embedded within a larger piece of discourse that has its own genre. Yet he understands Genesis to be historical. He lists Old Testament examples where the author showed that they knew the difference between reality and make-believe. For example, citing 2 Samuel 12 and 2 Samuel 14, 1 Kings 13, and so forth. He adds this: Genesis belongs to the same broad genre of narrative prose as does 1 and 2 Samuel and 1 and 2 Kings. Since there is no literary signal to tell us that it is fiction, and since, indeed, it belongs to a continuous temporal development leading from creation to the exile, we conclude it is non-fiction. Poythress cites Collins, who refers to Genesis 1 as exalted prose. But then he states this: what is it that makes it exalted? Yes, there is literary artistry. But once we distinguish formal features from content, we can see that what is most exalted about Genesis 1 is not the literary artistry, but the content. God speaks and acts in majesty to create the world and everything in it. The exaltedness of God and his activity imparts exaltedness to the passage, but that is the matter of content, not of genre. R. Kent Hughes calls Genesis narrative prose. He writes, "There is no question that the Genesis account is written as history." He calls Genesis 1 carefully structured and worded narrative prose history. Entire assemblies of scholars have come to the same consensus. For instance, after 2 years of research, the Presbyterian Church of America, the PCA, produced a 92-page study on how to interpret Genesis 1 and 2, the report of the Creation Study Committee in 2000. The committee stated this: "We believe that history, not myth, is the proper category for interpreting these chapters, and furthermore, that their history is true." The International Council on Biblical Inerrancy, the ICBI, was a collection of 334 leading evangelical scholars and leaders who convened to define and defend biblical inerrancy. The result of their work was the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy in 1978, which was followed by the Chicago Statement on Biblical Hermeneutics in 1982. Just for a brief list of these scholars, these included Gleason Archer, D.A. Carson, John Feinberg, Paul Feinberg, Norman Geisler, Wayne Grudem, R. Laird Harris, Harold Honer, Walter Kaiser, J.P. Moreland, J.I. Packer, J. Barton Payne, R.C. Sproul, John Wenham, and Edwin Yamauchi. The agreement of their combined scholarship stated this: "We deny that biblical infallibility and inerrancy are limited to spiritual, religious, or redemptive themes, exclusive of assertions in the fields of history and science. We further deny that scientific hypotheses about Earth history may properly be used to overturn the teaching of Scripture on creation and the flood." By this, they mean that the proper interpretation of science and of Scripture should never contradict with each other. In the Chicago Statement of Biblical Hermeneutics, in Article 22, we read this: "We affirm that Genesis 1 through 11 is factual, as is the rest of the book. We deny that the teachings of Genesis 1 through 11 are mythical." In Article 21, we read, "We affirm the harmony of special with general revelation, and therefore of biblical teaching with the facts of nature. We deny that any genuine scientific facts are inconsistent with the true meaning of any passage of Scripture." So in conclusion, let's be very clear. We are not giving evidence for why we believe the events in Genesis historically occurred. That's not our aim here. Instead, we are simply trying to establish what the text intends to communicate. To put this really simply, before we can defend the historicity of Genesis, we need to know whether or not Genesis claims to be history. Based on our analysis above, as well as the consensus of various academics in the field of biblical scholarship, we reject the classification of Genesis as poetry, mythology, legend, or any other dehistoricizing genre which is alien to the text.